Week 14 of the fantasy football season is here. Hopefully you enjoyed your Thanksgiving break, because now we dive into a critical matchup right before the fantasy playoffs, and we have 6 teams on a bye. What is going on, Headline Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there today as we make our run to the fantasy championship. And just like we always do in this show, we're gonna have a few different topics. So if you're looking for a certain section, there's timestamps down below. We're gonna cover some of the top injuries from just last weekend. A couple things we learned from last week in the NFL. How about the teams that are on an upcoming bye and the players we're going to be without, as well as some of the best potential options that may be available on your waiver wire. Now, before we get into the first section, it's Cyber Monday. I gotta give you a discount to something. How about a site-wide 25% discount over on Manscaped.com? I mean, Christmas is right around the corner. Cross off a few Christmas presents and get them at a discount. Whether it's a brand new lawnmower, a beard trimmer, whatever it is you need from beard to balls, they got you covered. So once again, that's 25% off, a site-wide sale at manscaped.com right now. There are links down below in the description, but all right, let's dive into the first section here and let's talk about some of the bigger injuries that we saw in week 13. And when it comes to injuries, we had a few big time names that went down in week 13, which absolutely sucks leading into the fantasy playoffs. First, Trevor Lawrence. He suffered a nasty concussion, more than likely going to be without him for a couple of weeks. Taysom Hill, he tore his ACL. It's official. He's done for the year, and I'm crying on the inside. Then we also lost Christian McCaffrey to another knee injury. He could be done for the fantasy season. He could be done for the NFL season. At this point, it's not looking good for fantasy owners. How about Lad McConkey? He suffered a knee or hip injury just this past week, hobbled off the field, but really not a lot of information on it just yet. He seemed to be okay after the game, but he is a name we're going to be paying attention to here throughout the week, along with Dallas Goedert, tight end of the Philadelphia Eagles. He suffered a knee injury. We already know that the Philadelphia Eagles have been without Devontae Smith. If they lose Dallas Goedert as well, there may be some names on the waiver wire that we could find to help us here over the next few weeks. But that's enough about injuries. Let's transition over to 5 things that we learned in week 13. First thing being, the Bills window may be open for years. With all the hype of Aaron Rodgers with the Jets, that vaunted Miami offense, and the new young nucleus in New England, the fact is still this: they all still suck, and Buffalo is going to be at the top of this division for the next few years. They've already clinched a playoff spot this year, and there's no one even close in this division to challenging them anytime in the near future. All right, next thing. Michael Penix may have actually been a good draft pick. Kirk Cousins has not looked great at all. Hasn't had a passing touchdown now in 3 weeks, and with the weapons that he has, that should not be the case. He's got way too many turnovers, and now the Falcons are on the verge of losing their division lead. If Kirk Cousins continues to struggle, we may see Michael Penix a lot earlier than a lot of people expected. How about this one? And this one may trigger a few people. Trey McBride is the best tight end in fantasy football, period. I know a lot of people are going to come out here and say, no, it's Brock Bowers. But with so many questions surrounding the Las Vegas Raiders and who is their quarterback of the future going to be, I still slightly give the edge to Trey McBride, who is used a butt ton in Arizona. The dude has 24 receptions in just his last 2 games alone. Just due to a little bit more stability, I'm putting McBride over Bowers as of right now. How about this one? Bryce Young is actually getting better. Now, no, he's not winning games, but he's playing visibly better, and he has been for multiple weeks now. Now, he's not at some Pro Bowl type level, but compared to what we've seen the last year and a half or so, even earlier this season, he has definitely progressed. We knew this is something that could be possible under Dave Canellis and this new coaching staff, and given the fact that he's got multiple weapons to throw to each and every week, it's really helping his fantasy production. Now, does that mean that he's going to lead the Carolina Panthers to a division title and the Super Bowl? Hell no. But he's not a total bust. He's actually playing pretty good football. And then lastly, the Texans are broken. Now, they almost lost to the damn Jaguars. That's how bad things are getting there right now. This offense just can't put it all together. Now, individually, Nico and Mixon, they're still producing, but this team as a whole just continues to struggle and cannot get on the same page. I know they've lost Stephon Diggs, but Nico Collins, Tank Dell, Dalton Schultz, Joe Mixon paired with CJ Stroud should be putting up a lot better offensive numbers than what we're seeing on a weekly basis from the Houston Texans. But now let's turn our attention to week 14. Here are the teams that are on upcoming bye. We got the Denver Broncos, so no Bo Nix, no Cortland Sutton. How about no Indianapolis Colts, which means no Jonathan Taylor, maybe Anthony Richardson if you were out there rolling the dice. How about the Patriots, no Ramondre Stevenson this week. The Washington Commanders, a lot of guys. No Jaden Daniels, no Brian Robinson, no Terry McLaurin, and no Zach Ertz. The Ravens also on a bye. This one hurts. No Lamar Jackson, no Derrick Henry, no Zay Flowers, and no Mark Andrews. And then the Texans are on a bye as well. Everyone we just mentioned, CJ Stroud, Joe Mixon, and Nico Collins will not be available for your fantasy football team in week 14. So we've gone through injuries and bye weeks. What is out there on the waiver wire for us to go after? Let's start off at the quarterback position. But you know what? I'm feeling generous. Let's do another discount first. How about 25% off our 2025 fantasy football draft guide? Our draft guide this year was absolutely filled with great advice to give you a great fantasy football team. That's where we told you about the likes of Jonnu Smith and Tyrone Tracy and Chase Brown before the season even started. So be proactive, get yourself ready to go for 2025. Just head over to tfhdraftguide.com and get 25% off next year's draft guide up until midnight on Cyber Monday. We've been running this deal all weekend long, so get in on it before it expires. But all right, let's dive into the quarterback position now. And we pull up the quarterbacks, we got the likes of Caleb Williams, Cooper Rush, Mac Jones, and Aiden O'Connell. I know, it's not pretty. But I'll start off with Caleb Williams because he is the highest owned quarterback of the bunch here. He's going up against San Francisco this week, and the offense is finally starting to come around in Chicago, and they're actually throwing the ball a lot more, which is great. Caleb Williams is averaging 43 pass attempts over his last 2 ball games. Now, after no touchdowns for a month, he now has 5 passing touchdowns over the last 2 weeks. He's also providing a little bit of a rushing upside each and every week. It would be great if the offensive line could protect him. He's the most sacked quarterback in the NFL, but in a matchup going up against San Francisco, they allow just over 16 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. If Caleb Williams is out there, not a bad choice here this week. Then Cooper Rush. He's only 9% owned, but he's going up against Cincinnati. And the numbers may not be huge, but he has scored at least 17 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games, and now gets a matchup going up against Cincinnati, who allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, and they were just absolutely torched by Russell Wilson for over 400 yards just last week. Now, after Cooper Rush, we got Mac Jones. Remember, we talked about the concussion to Trevor Lawrence, and Mac Jones is only 2% owned, and he's going up against Tennessee more than likely this week. He really played better in relief of Trevor Lawrence last week than what we saw from him as a starter. 235 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, and he played less than a full game. Now, Jacksonville, we know this. Their defense is not great, and it causes their offense to play from behind almost every single week. Now, between that and the fact that the Tennessee Titans allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, Mac Jones may not be safe, but he's an option for you in week 14, alongside Aiden O'Connell of the Las Vegas Raiders. He's only 6% owned. He's going up against Tampa Bay. He comes back as the starter last week, and he puts up 340 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Kansas City Chiefs. This is another team similar to the Jacksonville Jaguars. They're going to fall behind and play from behind a lot. Now Aiden O'Connell gets a matchup going up against Tampa Bay, who allows the 2nd most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. Another one of these guys that may not be sexy in week 14, but if you're desperate for a quarterback play, has a great matchup. But now we transition over to the running back position.
Oh, hello there. My name's Kyle, and you're not used to seeing me on the waiver wire video, but today I'm going to drop in for just a few moments because our good friend Jake is traveling back from Arizona to North Carolina, and in the process of traveling, the San Francisco 49ers decided to announce that not only is Christian McCaffrey going to be missing the rest of the season, but so will Jordan Mason, and because of that, we had to cut out the part where we talked about trying to pick up Jordan Mason if he had become available in any of your leagues. that clearly won't work anymore. So next guy up is going to be one of my favorite draft prospects from the 2024 draft, Isaac Guerendo, and he's going to have an opportunity down the stretch to help out those teams that desperately need it at the running back position. So if your team needs some help and you need a guy that's going to be starter caliber that has shown some burst this season and some potential fantasy production, Isaac Guerendo could end up being the guy for you. So definitely take a shot on him if he's out there. He should be one of the top priority waiver ads of this week, and you may need to spend a little fab money to make it work as well. But I can promise you that more than likely, it's going to be fab money well spent.
How about Kamani Vidal of the Los Angeles Chargers, 25% owned, going up against Kansas City this week. And we didn't really see any increased workload in week 13. They talked about it leading up to the game, but didn't really show it on the field. But there wasn't some total commitment to Gus Edwards either. Gus only out-touched Kamani Vidal 7 touches to 4 touches. Neither one of these guys got a lot of work, but Kamani Vidal is a little bit more of a stash. He's going up against Kansas City this week, and no team in the NFL allows fewer fantasy points per game to the running back position than the Kansas City Chiefs, so this is not an easy one. How about Sincere McCormick of the Las Vegas Raiders? No one out there really owns him, only 1% owned, and he's going up against Tampa Bay. Now, I know the running game in Las Vegas is an absolute mess. It's really not appealing to anyone, but with so many injuries in this backfield, we just saw Sincere McCormick go out there and lead this backfield in carries and yards last week against a tough Kansas City defense. At this point of the season, when the Raiders are dealing with so many injuries in the backfield, why not give McCormick a little bit more of a chance down the stretch to see what they have in him? Now, we really need to pay attention to the availability of Alexander Mattison and Zamir White, but if they were to miss again, McCormick may be a spot start fill-in here for week 14 if need be. And then lastly, I wanted to include Ray Davis of the Buffalo Bills. He's only 24% owned. He's got a game this week going up against the Rams. And with Buffalo already clinching the playoffs, they're going to want to keep their studs healthy. I would not be surprised if we don't see more Ray Davis down the stretch in these cold weather games just to keep James Cook fresh for the playoffs. He's not someone we can throw in with a lot of confidence, but if you're desperate for a running back, there are worse options out there than Ray Davis. All right, now let's move on to the wide receiver position. Top of the list, I got Kevontae Turpin of the Dallas Cowboys going up against Cincinnati. He's only 2% owned, and honestly, he's one of my favorite pickups this week. Maybe it's because he continues to win me money on Underdog Fantasy, but that's a different story. They're just manufacturing touches for him at this point. They're giving him opportunities weekly to get the ball in space and try to make something happen. The guy's an absolute burner, and he has the eye of quarterback Cooper Rush. Now he gets a matchup, though, going up against Cincinnati, and Cincinnati allows the 10th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Then we got Nick Westbrook-Akine of the Tennessee Titans. He's 28% owned. He's going up against Jacksonville, and I have talked about this guy for weeks. Why is he still only 28% owned? This dude is racking up TDs faster than a Victoria's Secret store out there. 8 touchdowns over his last 8 games played. Now, he is touchdown dependent because the volume and yardage aren't that high, but in a matchup going up against Jacksonville, they allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Then we got his opponent in that game, Parker Washington, only 4% owned going up against Tennessee, and with Mac Jones under center, we really need to consider Parker Washington. He just had a season high in targets, receptions, yards, and his first touchdown of the season. On a team in Jacksonville with no identity, there is no reason to think that he cannot continue to get this kind of volume. In a battle of some bottom feeders, I wouldn't be surprised if Parker Washington has another solid performance in week 14. How about Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers going up against Philadelphia? Now he's 51% owned, and I've been talking about him for a few weeks as well. People need to add Adam Thielen. He just had 10 targets, 8 catches, 99 yards, and a touchdown, which means a lot more people are going to go after him. Had you just picked him up a week or 2 ago when we said so, you would have had him for a lot cheaper. But we've seen him produce with Bryce Young in the past, and now Bryce is playing better than he ever has. He's going to be the binky of Bryce Young, and he could be a solid bench stash for your fantasy team heading into the fantasy playoffs. They're going up against Philadelphia. It's not the easiest of matchups matchups, but more than likely they're going to be losing and having to throw the ball all 4 quarters, so I wanted to include Adam Thielen. I guess you could also say Xavier Legette could be an option here as well. And then Keon Coleman. He's 43% owned. They're going up against the Rams this week, and we have been waiting for his return, and he seems to be super close. There are some great late season matchups for Buffalo, and with them already clinching the playoff spot, they're going to need to get Keon Coleman back up to game speed quickly. But if they could have Keon Coleman good to go entering the NFL playoffs, the Bills are going to be tough to beat. Now, because of that, if he's out there and he's available on your waiver wire, I'm stashing him on my bench just in case. All right, how about the tight end position? We'll start off with Juwan Johnson of the New Orleans Saints going up against the Giants. He's only 6% owned, and the Saints just can't seem to stay healthy. Olave, Shaheed, now Taysom Hill done for the year, and we just saw Juwan Johnson tied with Taysom Hill for a team-high 7 targets last week. But now Taysom Hill is done for the year. Some of those targets are going to go somewhere, and there's really nowhere else to look than Juwan Johnson. He's highly available at only 6% owned and is definitely a plug-and-play tight end if need be. What about Grant Calcaterra of the Philadelphia Eagles? Only 2% owned, and they're going up against Carolina. Now, with the injury and unknown surrounding Dallas Goedert, we could maybe see a little bit more Grant Calcaterra here in Week 14. We've seen him produce earlier in the season when given an opportunity, and we also know that Devontae Smith is still not 100% healthy. But this is why I really wanted to include him. If Dallas Goedert were to miss this game, going up against Carolina, there is no team in the NFL that allows more fantasy points per game to the tight end position than the Carolina Panthers. So if you're desperate for a tight end, Grant Calcaterra in this matchup, especially if Dallas Goedert does not play, could be a great option for us. How about Theo Johnson of the New York Giants? He's going up against the Saints. He's only 6% owned. Now, his ceiling isn't overly high, but he is seeing right around 6 targets a game, so at least he's getting an opportunity. In a matchup going up against the Saints, they allow just over 8 fantasy points per contest to the tight end position. If you're desperate, if he puts up 8 points in your lineup, you're probably happy. Just not a lot of touchdowns to go around there in New York. They are the lowest scoring team in the NFL. And then lastly, Pat Freiermuth going up against the Cleveland Browns. He's 43% owned, and really similar to Theo Johnson and Grant Calcaterra, he's not going to be a guy that gets huge volume, but he will get you right around 5 targets a week or so going up against Cleveland. They allow the 11th most fantasy points per game to the tight end position, so Pat Freiermuth in Week 14 becomes a streaming option. Now, speaking of streaming options, there are a couple streaming Ds out there if you need them. How about the Seattle Seahawks? They're 25% owned going up against Arizona, and they are one of the hotter defenses right now in the NFL. They've had 10 fantasy points now in back-to-back games, and they scored 20 fantasy points against this Arizona offense just 2 weeks ago. Then after them, we have their opponent in that game, the Arizona Cardinals, only 16% owned going up against Seattle. They've been a solid defense as of late here as well. They've scored at least 10 fantasy points in 3 of their last 4 ball games, and they're a top 10 fantasy defense on the season. And then lastly, the Saints, if you're desperate, they're 15% owned going up against the Giants. They haven't been one of the best defenses this year, but going against the Giants, who don't score a lot of touchdowns, like I mentioned earlier, the lowest scoring team in the NFL, the Saints could be a safer floor option for you in Week 14. All right, so there you have our waiver wire show for Week 14 fantasy football. With so many injuries and so many teams on a bye, the waiver wire at this point of the season starts to look a little bit thin. Even though there may not be many options that will help you this week, try to think about weeks coming up as well. Get yourself some added depth heading into the fantasy playoffs. But I'm gonna go ahead and get out of here today. This is gonna be my last video here from Arizona, going back to North Carolina, back in the home office, and we're ready for the fantasy playoffs. Now, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, but most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.